For as long as humans have existed, they have looked up at the night sky and wondered what it all meant. The moon, the stars, the slow dance of planets across the darkness seas. Celestial bodies have guided travelers, marked the seasons, and inspired countless myths. But sometimes, something unusual appeared. A streak of light with a glowing tail. A moon that turned the color of blood. A star that was not there before. When these strange events occurred, ancient people believed that the heavens were speaking. They saw these signs as messages from the gods, warnings of things to come. Kings consulted their astrologers. Priests made sacrifices. Common people whispered fearful prayers in the dark. Today, we understand the science behind comets and eclipses. We know that these are natural events, predictable and explainable. Yet something curious remains in the historical record. On at least 3 occasions, unusual celestial events appeared in the sky just before major disasters struck. A blazing comet crossed the heavens before a king fell in battle. Another great comet lit up the night before. The largest army in history marched to its doom. A blood-red lunar eclipse darkened the sky just days before one of the world's greatest cities fell forever. In ARJKs, people saw the signs. In each case, warnings were given. And in each case, those warnings went unheeded or were interpreted in exactly the wrong way. Were these merely coincidences? Random alignments of cosmic timing and human tragedy? Or is there something more to these stories? Something that speaks to the mysterious relationship between the heavens and the earth below? The answers, as we shall see, are not as simple as we might hope. Long before telescopes, satellites, or space stations, humans were already students of the night sky. Every ancient civilization, from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the highlands of Central America, developed a deep and careful relationship with the stars above them. The sky was not merely a beautiful backdrop to their lives. It was a calendar, a compass, and most importantly, a source of divine communication. The Babylonians were among the first to keep detailed records of celestial events. Their clay tablets, dating back over 3,000 years, documented the movements of planets, the phases of the moon, and the appearance of unusual lights in the sky. These ancient astronomers believed that the gods wrote their intentions across the heavens. Every celestial event carried meaning, and it was the job of trained priests to interpret these messages for their kings. Halfway around the world, Chinese astronomers developed their own sophisticated system of sky watching. They recorded guest stars that appeared suddenly and then faded away. They tracked comets, which they called broom stars because of their sweeping tails. In their tradition, these unusual appearances often signaled the rise or fall of dynasties. A new star might announce the birth of a great leader. A comet might warn of war or famine. The Egyptians aligned their pyramids with specific stars. The Greeks named the constellations and developed complex theories about the nature of the cosmos. The Maya built observatories and created calendars of remarkable accuracy. Across cultures and centuries, the message was the same. The sky was watching, and the sky was speaking. Humanity simply needed to learn how to listen. Among all celestial events, 2 stood out as particularly significant. Comets, with their long glowing tails, appeared without warning and lingered for weeks or months before fading away. Eclipses, whether the sun or moon, temporarily disrupted the natural order of light and darkness. Both events inspired awe and fear in equal measure. Today, we understand that comets are balls of ice, dust, and rock orbiting the sun. When a comet approaches the inner solar system, the sun's heat causes it to release gas and dust, forming the characteristic glowing tail that always points away from the sun. Comets follow predictable paths, though some have orbits so long that they appear only once in many human lifetimes. Lunar eclipses occur when the Earth passes between the sun and the moon, casting our planet's shadow across the lunar surface. During a total lunar eclipse, the moon can appear deep red or orange. This happens because Earth's atmosphere bends some sunlight around our planet, filtering out blue light and allowing red light to reach the moon. The effect is beautiful and completely natural. But ancient observers had none of this knowledge. To them, comets were terrifying mysteries. Unlike stars and planets, which followed regular patterns, comets appeared from nowhere. They did not move like anything else in the sky. They grew brighter, developed strange tails, and then slowly faded into nothing. It is no wonder that many cultures called them disaster stars. In fact, our word disaster comes from the Greek words meaning bad star. Eclipses were equally disturbing. The moon was a symbol of order and regularity. Its phases marked the months. Its light guided travelers at night. When the moon suddenly darkened and turned blood red, it seemed as though the natural order itself was breaking down. In many cultures, people believed that a monster or demon was attacking the moon. They would make loud noises, bang drums, or shoot arrows into the sky to drive the creature away. Given the importance of celestial events, it is not surprising that ancient rulers employed specialists to watch the sky and interpret its messages. These court astrologers held positions of great power and responsibility. When a comet appeared, or an eclipse occurred, the king would turn to his astrologers for guidance. Was this a good omen or a bad one? Did it foretell victory or defeat? Should the king proceed with his plans or wait for a more favorable sign? The interpretation of celestial events was never straightforward. The same comet could be seen as a blessing by one side and a curse by the other. Much depended on the skill and politics of the interpreter. Astrologers who delivered unwelcome messages might find themselves out of favor or worse. Over time, this created a system where celestial signs were often interpreted to please the powerful rather than reveal uncomfortable truths. History is filled with accounts of celestial events that seemed to announce major turning points. Some of these stories have become legendary. In 44 BC, a bright comet appeared in the sky shortly after the assassination of Julius Caesar. The Roman people called it Caesar's comet and believed it carried the soul of the murdered dictator to the heavens. Caesar's heir, Octavian, used this sign to strengthen his claim to power. The comet became not just an omen, but a political tool. Similar stories exist across cultures. In Korea, royal astronomers kept careful records of unusual celestial events, linking them to the fates of kings and kingdoms. In medieval Europe, monks recorded comets and eclipses in their chronicles, almost always connecting them to deaths, wars, or other calamities. These records reveal a consistent pattern of belief that the heavens and the earth were intimately connected. Historians today note an important issue with these accounts. When a celestial event was followed by a disaster, people remembered it and wrote it down. When a comet appeared and nothing significant happened, there was little reason to record the connection. Over centuries, this selective recording created the impression that comets and eclipses were reliable predictors of tragedy. In reality, celestial events occur regularly throughout history. Some coincide with major events. Many do not. The human tendency to remember hits and forget misses has shaped our perception of cosmic omens. Still, the stories that do exist are compelling. The coincidences, when they occur, are often remarkable, and in at least 3 notable cases. The timing between celestial event and disaster was so close that even skeptical modern observers pause to consider the strange alignments of history. This narrative will examine 3 remarkable moments when the stars seem to warn of coming disaster. These events are separated by centuries and occurred in vastly different parts of the world. Yet they share a common thread. In each case, an unusual celestial event appeared before a major catastrophe. In each case, the warning was either ignored or misunderstood, and in each case, the consequences were devastating. The first event takes us to England in the year 1066, when a blazing comet crossed the sky just months before the Battle of Hastings changed the course of European history. The second event moves forward to 1811, when the brightest comet in living memory appeared as Napoleon Bonaparte prepared for his disastrous invasion of Russia. The third event reaches back to 1453, when a blood-red lunar eclipse darkened the sky over Constantinople just days before the ancient city fell to Ottoman forces. These 3 events offer more than just fascinating historical coincidences. They reveal something deep about human nature, our desire to find meaning in the universe, our tendency to interpret signs in ways that suit our hopes, and our remarkable ability to ignore warnings even when they appear directly overhead. As we explore each story, we will see leaders who trusted too much in their own destiny, populations paralyzed by fear, and the strange dance between celestial timing and human tragedy. Whether the stars truly warned of these disasters remains an open question. What is certain is that the people who lived through these events believed the warnings were real. Their beliefs shaped their actions, their hopes, and ultimately, their fates. The story begins in the spring of 1066, when a brilliant light appeared in the skies above England. In the early months of 1066, England was already a kingdom on edge. King Edward the Confessor had died in January without a clear heir, and the crown had passed to Harold Godwinson, a powerful English nobleman. Harold's claim to the throne was disputed by two formidable rivals. Across the English Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, insisted that Edward had promised him the crown years earlier. Far to the north, Harold Hardrada, the fearsome King of Norway, also believed he had a rightful claim to the English throne. War seemed inevitable. Then, in late April, something strange appeared in the night sky. A brilliant light with a long, glowing tail became visible over England. Night after night, the object grew brighter and more prominent. It hung in the western sky after sunset, its tail stretching across the heavens like a ghostly sword. For nearly 2 weeks, the celestial visitor dominated the darkness. Farmers paused in their fields to stare upward. Villagers gathered in fear and wonder. Monks in their monasteries recorded the event in careful Latin, noting that such a sign surely foretold great changes. The comet was not visible only over England. Observers across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia all recorded its appearance. Chinese astronomers noted the broom star in their detailed celestial records. Byzantine scholars in Constantinople wrote of the unusual light. In Normandy, William and his followers also watched a strange visitor cross the sky. Modern astronomers have identified this comet as Halley's Comet, the famous periodic comet that returns to the inner solar system approximately every 75 to 76 years. In 1066, of course, no one knew this. No one understood that this same comet had appeared before and would appear again. To the people of that time, the comet was a unique and terrifying messenger from the heavens. The timing could not have been more dramatic. A disputed succession, rival claimants gathering their forces, and now a blazing sign in the sky that seemed to announce that great events were about to unfold. The only question was what those events would be and for whom the comet's message was intended. To understand the significance of the comet's appearance, we must look back to the events that preceded it. King Edward the Confessor had ruled England for over 2 decades, but his reign had been marked by political tension and uncertainty. Edward was deeply religious, and had spent much of his life in Normandy before becoming king. He had no children, and the question of who would succeed him had troubled the kingdom for years. When Edward died on January 5, 1066, the succession crisis that many had feared finally arrived. Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, and the most powerful nobleman in England, moved quickly to secure the throne. He claimed that Edward had named him as heir on his deathbed. The English nobles, known as the Witan, accepted his claim and crowned him king the very next day. But Harold's swift coronation did not end the matter. It only intensified it. William of Normandy was furious when he learned of Harold's coronation. He insisted that Edward had promised him the English throne during a visit years earlier. William also claimed that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support his claim to the crown. According to Norman sources, Harold had made this oath while visiting Normandy in 1064, perhaps not realizing he was swearing over sacred relics. Whether this story was true or exaggerated, William was determined to enforce what he saw as his right. Meanwhile, Harold Hardrada of Norway had his own reasons to claim the English throne. His claim was based on an agreement between earlier Norwegian and English kings. Though the claim was perhaps the weakest of the three, Harold was a legendary warrior who had fought across Europe and the Byzantine Empire. He was not a man easily dismissed. By the spring of 1066, Harold of England faced the prospect of invasion from 2 directions. He knew that war was coming. The appearance of the comet in April only heightened the sense that destiny itself was about to intervene in the affairs of the English kingdom. Contemporary sources suggest that Harold and his advisors viewed the comet with deep concern. In the medieval worldview, comets were almost universally seen as bad omens. They announced the deaths of kings, the fall of kingdoms, and the coming of war and destruction. For a king whose throne was already contested, the appearance of such a sign must have been deeply troubling. The English people shared their king's unease. Chronicles from the period describe widespread fear and anxiety. Common people believed that the comet announced disaster. Some may have questioned whether Harold's claim to the throne was truly legitimate. If the heavens themselves seemed to be sending warnings, perhaps it was a sign that Harold's reign would not last. We cannot know exactly what Harold thought when he looked up at the comet in the spring of 1066. But we can imagine the weight of uncertainty that must have pressed upon him. He was preparing for war against powerful enemies. His kingdom was divided in its loyalties, and now the sky itself seemed to be speaking of doom. Across the English Channel, William of Normandy looked at the same comet and drew a very different conclusion. For William, the celestial visitor was not a warning of disaster but a sign of divine favor. He believed that his claim to the English throne was righteous and that God supported his cause. The comet, in his interpretation, announced not his doom but his coming triumph. This difference in interpretation is one of the most remarkable aspects of the 1066 story. The same celestial event was visible to both Harold and William. Both men knew that comets were significant signs, yet each interpreted the sign according to his own hopes and fears. Harold saw a warning. William saw encouragement. The comet was silent, but the men who observed it heard exactly what they were prepared to hear. William began preparing his invasion fleet with renewed energy. He gathered ships, assembled knights, and recruited soldiers from across Normandy and beyond. The comet had not made him hesitate. If anything, it had strengthened his resolve. Through the summer of 1066, Harold waited and watched. He stationed his army along the southern coast of England, expecting William's invasion fleet to cross the Channel at any time. But summer storms kept the Norman ships in port. Weeks passed, and Harold's army grew restless. The men were farmers and laborers who had been called away from their fields during harvest season. Eventually, Harold was forced to disband much of his force and allowed the men to return home. Then, in September, news arrived that changed everything. Harold Hardrada had landed in northern England with a massive Norwegian army. The Norwegian king had allied with Harold's own brother, Tostig, who had been exiled from England and now sought revenge. Together, they had defeated an English force and were threatening to take control of the north. Harold acted with remarkable speed. He gathered what forces he could and marched north at an extraordinary pace. On September 25, 1066, he caught the Norwegian army by surprise at Stamford Bridge. The battle was fierce and bloody, but the English emerged victorious. Harold Hardrada was killed, as was Tostig. The Norwegian threat was ended, but Harold had no time to celebrate. Just 3 days after his victory at Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy finally crossed the English Channel. The Norman fleet landed at Pevensey on the southern coast on September 28, 1066. Harold received the news while still in the north and immediately began the long march south. The English army covered nearly 250 miles in just over 2 weeks, an incredible feat of endurance. But the soldiers were exhausted from their earlier battle and the brutal march. When Harold arrived in the south, some of his advisors urged him to wait, to gather more troops, to let William come to him. But Harold was determined to confront the invader immediately. Perhaps he remembered the comet and feared what delay might bring. The two armies met at a place later called Battle, near the town of Hastings. On October 14, 1066, Harold positioned his forces on a hill, forming a shield wall that the Normans would have to attack uphill. The English army was strong in infantry but lacked cavalry. The Norman force included mounted knights, archers, and infantry in a more balanced combination. The battle lasted most of the day. The Normans launched attack after attack against the English shield wall, but the English held firm. At several points, Norman troops broke and fled, only to be rallied by William himself, who rode among his men to prove he was still alive. The turning point came late in the afternoon. Norman archers began aiming their arrows high, so they would fall among the English from above. According to tradition, Harold was struck in the eye by an arrow, though. Some historians debate this account. What is certain is that Harold was killed during the battle. When news of his death spread, the English resistance collapsed. The shield wall broke, and the Normans swept forward. By nightfall, the battle was over. William had won. The comet of 1066 did not fade from memory after the battle. It became one of the most enduring symbols of the Norman conquest. The most famous depiction appears in the Bayeux Tapestry, a remarkable embroidered cloth created within a few decades of the conquest. The tapestry tells the story of the events of 1066 in vivid images, almost like a medieval comic strip. In one famous scene, the comet blazes across the upper portion of the tapestry, while men below point upward in amazement. Nearby, Harold sits on his throne, looking troubled. A group of ghostly ships appears in the lower margin, perhaps symbolizing the coming invasion. The Latin inscription reads, Estimaran stellam. They marvel at the star. The tapestry's creators clearly saw the comet as a significant part of the story. It was not merely a curiosity in the sky, but an integral element of the narrative of conquest. The comet announced what was to come. The English marveled at it, but did not understand. And then William arrived, and everything changed. Centuries later, astronomers realized that the comet of 1066 was the same celestial body that had appeared many times before in human history, and would appear again. Edmund Halley, an English astronomer working in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, calculated the comet's orbit and predicted its return. When the comet reappeared in 1758, as Halley had predicted, it was named in his honor. Halley's comet has returned several times since 1066. It appeared in 1835, in 1910, and most recently in 1986. Each time, people have looked up and remembered the long history of human encounters with this celestial but no appearance has been as historically significant as the one in 1066, when a king fell and an age ended under its pale light. The pattern of celestial warning and human tragedy would repeat itself centuries later, in a different land and under very different circumstances. In March 1811, astronomers first detected a faint new object moving through the constellation Aries. At first, it appeared as little more than a fuzzy patch of light, visible only through telescopes. But over the following months, the comet grew steadily brighter. Belate Sumer. It had become visible to the naked eye. Biota, it had become one of the most spectacular celestial displays in recorded history. The Great Comet of 1811 was extraordinary by any measure. Its comet, a glowing cloud of gas and dust surrounding the comet's core, was larger than the sun itself. Its tail stretched across a vast arc of the night sky. Unlike many comets that come and go within a few weeks, this one remained visible for an astonishing 260 days. For nearly 9 months, the comet dominated the heavens, visible from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. People across the globe marveled at the spectacle. In Europe, the comet became a popular topic of conversation in salons and taverns alike. Artists painted it, poets wrote about it, newspapers devoted considerable space to descriptions of its appearance and debates about its meaning. Not all the attention was fearful. In the wine-growing regions of France and Germany, 1811 happened to produce an exceptional grape harvest. The warm summer that helped make the comet so visible also created ideal conditions for vineyards. The resulting wines were of such remarkable quality that they became known as comet wines. 4 years afterward, bottles from the 1811 vintage commanded premium prices. Their labels sometimes feature images of the comet. Yet for many observers, the comet stirred deeper and more troubling thoughts. In an age when war had consumed Europe for nearly 2 decades, a blazing light in the sky could not be viewed as merely a curiosity. The old beliefs about comets, as harbingers of disaster, had not disappeared. Across the continent, people wondered what the great comet might be announcing. At the time of the comet's appearance, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. Through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and ruthless ambition, he had transformed himself from an obscure Corsican artillery officer into the master of continental Europe. His empire stretched from the borders of Spain to the plains of Poland. Kings and emperors trembled at his name. The map of Europe had been redrawn according to his will. By 1811, Napoleon had defeated Austria 4 times, crushed Prussia, humiliated Russia, and reduced most of the German states to vassals. He had placed his brothers and relatives on the thrones of Spain, Holland, Westphalia, and Naples. The French Empire directly controlled vast territories, while allied and subordinate states surrounded it in a web of power that seemed unbreakable. Yet there were cracks in this magnificent edifice. The ongoing war in Spain was draining French resources in a brutal guerrilla conflict. Britain remained unconquered behind its naval wall, and increasingly, one power was defying Napoleon's will: Russia. At the heart of the growing conflict between France and Russia was the continental system, Napoleon's ambitious attempt to defeat Britain through economic warfare. Since he could not invade the island nation, Napoleon sought to strangle it by closing all European ports to British trade. Every nation allied with or conquered by France was required to refuse British goods and ships. For a time, the system worked, but it caused hardship across Europe, including in France's own allied states. Russia, under Tsar Alexander I, had initially agreed to the continental system after its defeat by Napoleon in 1807. But by 1810, Russia was openly violating the agreement, allowing British ships to trade in its ports. The Russian economy needed British goods, and Alexander was unwilling to destroy his country's commerce to serve French interests. Napoleon viewed this defiance as intolerable. He began to contemplate the unthinkable, massive invasion of Russia that would bring the Tsar to heel and complete his domination of Europe. When the Great Comet appeared in 1811, Napoleon reportedly viewed it as a personal omen. According to accounts from those close to him, the emperor believed that the comet announced his coming triumph. Just as great celestial events had marked the fates of emperors and conquerors throughout history, this magnificent comet seemed to herald Napoleon's greatest victory yet. The heavens themselves appeared to be celebrating the power and destiny of the French Empire. This interpretation was not unusual for Napoleon. Throughout his career, he had displayed a sense of personal destiny, a belief that fate or providence had chosen him for greatness. He spoke of his star, referring to the fortune that had carried him from obscurity to empire. The appearance of a great comet at this moment of his power seemed to confirm what he already believed about himself. Not everyone around Napoleon shared his optimistic interpretation. Some of his advisors and marshals had private doubts about the wisdom of invading Russia. They knew the vast distances involved, the difficulty of supplying a large army across such territory, and the brutal Russian winters. The Russian strategy of trading space for time, drawing an invader deep into the country before striking, was well known. These concerns were raised in various ways, though perhaps not as directly or forcefully as they might have been. Napoleon was not a man who welcomed contradiction. Those who disagreed with him too openly risked his displeasure. The comet, whatever it truly meant, could not persuade those who had already made up their minds. Napoleon was determined to invade Russia. No celestial sign and no earthly counsel would change his decision. Through the winter of 1811 and into 1812, preparations continued. The largest army Europe had ever seen was being assembled. The comet faded from the sky, but the course it had seemed to announce was set in motion. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée began crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory. The force was staggering in its size, over 600,000 soldiers drawn from France and all its allied and subject states. Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, and many others marched alongside French troops. It was the largest military force ever assembled in European history up to that point. Napoleon's plan was characteristically bold. He would advance rapidly, force the Russian armies into a decisive battle, destroy them, and compel Tsar Alexander to accept peace terms. The campaign would be over within weeks, perhaps a few months at most. Napoleon had defeated Russia before, in 1807. He expected to do so again, but the Russians did not cooperate with Napoleon's plans. Instead of standing and fighting, the Russian armies they fell back deeper and deeper into the vast Russian interior, drawing the French further from their supply lines. As they retreated, they destroyed crops, burned villages, and removed anything that might be useful to the invaders. This scorched earth policy denied Napoleon the ability to feed his army from the land. Even before encountering significant Russian resistance, the Grande Armée began to suffer. The summer of 1812 was brutally hot, and the marching was relentless. Disease spread through the ranks. Horses died by the thousands, unable to find adequate food and water. Soldiers deserted or fell behind, unable to keep pace with the advance. The Russian armies continued their retreat, occasionally fighting rearguard actions, but never accepting the decisive battle that Napoleon sought. Weeks turned into months. The French advanced further and further from safety, their supply lines stretching dangerously thin. Still, Napoleon pressed on, determined to catch the Russians and force them to fight. Finally, In early September, the Russians made a stand. At the village of Borodino, about 75 miles west of Moscow, the Russian army under Marshal Kutuzov prepared to defend the road to the ancient capital. On September 7th, the two armies clashed in one of the bloodiest single-day battles in history up to that time. The fighting was savage and relentless. French forces attacked Russian fortifications again and again. Artillery fire tore through massed infantry. Cavalry charged and countercharged across the battlefield. By the end of the day, over 70,000 men lay dead or wounded drew flee, 30,000 French and 40,000 Russians. Napoleon claimed victory, as the Russians eventually withdrew from the field. But it was a hollow triumph. The Russian army had not been destroyed. It retreated in good order, still a fighting force, and the cost to the French had been enormous losses they could not easily replace so far from home. 1 week after Borodino, on September 14, 1812, Napoleon entered Moscow. It should have been his moment of triumph, the culmination of the campaign. Instead, he found a largely empty city. Most of the population had fled, and then, that night and over the following days, fires broke out across Moscow, whether started by Russian patriots, French looters, or accidents. The fires quickly spread out of control. Much of the city burned, including the supplies and shelter that Napoleon desperately needed for his army. For over a month, Napoleon waited in the ruins of Moscow, hoping that Tsar Alexander would agree to negotiate. No offer of peace came. The Tsar had decided to fight on, whatever the cost. As October arrived and temperatures began to drop, Napoleon faced a terrible realization. He was over 500 miles from friendly territory. His army was weakened and demoralized. Winter was approaching. He had no choice but to retreat. The retreat from Moscow began on October 19, 1812, and quickly became one of the greatest military disasters in history. Napoleon initially hoped to take a southern route through territories not yet devastated by the campaign, but Russian forces blocked this path at the Battle of Moloch, forcing the French to retreat along the same route they had advanced through a wasteland already stripped of food and shelter. As the army marched west, winter descended with terrible force. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Soldiers who lacked adequate clothing froze to death where they stood. Horses died and were eaten. Men fought over scraps of food. The discipline that had held the Grande Army together began to collapse. The retreating French were not left to suffer in peace. Russian cavalry and Cossack raiders harassed the columns constantly, picking off stragglers and attacking vulnerable units. The Russian regular army followed at a distance, waiting for opportunities to strike. What had been an orderly retreat became a desperate flight for survival. One of the most horrific episodes occurred at the crossing of the Berezina River in late November. Russian forces closed in from multiple directions as the French attempted to cross on hastily built bridges. Thousands of soldiers were killed in the fighting or drowned in the icy waters. Many more were captured. The crossing became a scene of chaos and tragedy that survivors would remember with horror for the rest of their lives. By the time the remnants of the Grande Army staggered back across the Russian border in December 1812, the catastrophe was complete. Of the Mauritanian 600,000 soldiers who had crossed into Russia 6 months earlier, fewer than 100,000 returned. Some estimates suggest the number was even lower. The rest had been killed in battle, died of disease, frozen to death, or been captured. Napoleon himself survived, abandoning his army in early December to rush back to Paris and organize new forces. But his empire had been dealt a blow from which it would never fully recover. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded him was shattered. The nations of Europe, sensing weakness, would soon unite against him. Within 2 years, Napoleon would be defeated and exiled. The comet that he had believed heralded his greatest triumph had instead appeared before his greatest disaster. The heavens had offered what many saw as a warning. Napoleon had seen only confirmation of his own destiny, and the price of that misinterpretation was paid by hundreds of thousands of soldiers who would never return home. In the spring of 1453, Constantinople stood as it had for over 1,000 years, the greatest city in the Christian world, the capital of an empire that traced its origins back to ancient Rome. The city sat at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, controlling the strategic strait that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Its massive walls had repelled invaders for centuries. Its churches, palaces, and monuments testified to a glory that had once spanned 3 continents. But the Byzantine Empire of 1453 was only a shadow of what it had been. Centuries of war, plague, and internal conflict had reduced the empire to little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. The great provinces that had once provided soldiers and revenue were long lost. The population of Constantinople, which had once numbered hundreds of thousands, had shrunk to perhaps 50,000 souls. The famous walls still stood, but there were barely enough defenders to man them. The man who ruled this diminished empire was Constantine XI Palaeologos, the last in a line of emperors stretching back over a millennium to Constantine the Great, who had founded the city that bore his name. Constantine XI was by all accounts a brave and capable ruler, but he had inherited an impossible situation. His empire was surrounded on all sides by the growing power of the Ottoman Turks. Constantine knew that his city was in mortal danger. He had spent years seeking help from the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe. He had agreed to a controversial union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, hoping this would bring military support from the Pope and the Western nations. But the help that arrived was far short of what was needed. A few hundred soldiers from Genoa, some Venetians, and a handful of others. Against the might of the Ottoman Empire, it would not be enough. Constantinople was a city steeped in prophecy and religious symbolism. Its people believed deeply that their city enjoyed divine protection. According to one widely held belief, Constantinople could never fall while the moon was full and bright in the sky. The city had been founded by Constantine and blessed by the Virgin Mary. Surely God would not allow it to be conquered by unbelievers. Other prophecies were more troubling. An old tradition held that just as the city had been founded by an emperor named Constantine with a mother named Helena, so too would it fall under an emperor named Constantine with a mother named Helena. Constantine XI's mother was indeed named Helena. The emperor was aware of this prophecy, but he refused to let it determine his fate. He would fight for his city regardless of what the old stories said. The man who intended to prove the prophecies true was Mehmed II, the young Sultan of the Ottoman Turks. Only 21 years old in 1453, Mehmed was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly determined to achieve what his ancestors had not. Taking Constantinople had been a dream of Muslim rulers for centuries. The Prophet Muhammad himself had reportedly praised those who would conquer the city. Mehmed intended to be the one to earn that glory. Mehmed prepared for the siege with meticulous care. He assembled an army that numbered perhaps 80,000 soldiers or more, vastly outnumbering the defenders. He gathered a fleet to control the waters around the city. Most importantly, he commissioned the construction of massive cannons, including an enormous weapon capable of firing stone balls weighing over 500 kilograms. These guns would challenge the walls that had protected Constantinople for 1,000 years. On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman army arrived before the walls of Constantinople. The siege that followed would last nearly 8 weeks, a period of almost constant bombardment, attack, and desperate defense. Day after day, the great Ottoman cannons fired into the walls, slowly battering gaps in the ancient fortifications. Night after night, the defenders worked frantically to repair the damage before the next assault. The Byzantines fought with courage that exceeded their small numbers. The Genoese captain, Giovanni Giustiniani, led the defense of the most vulnerable sections of wall. Greek, Italian, and even some Turkish defenders stood together against the overwhelming Ottoman force. Emperor Constantine himself was frequently seen on the walls, encouraging his soldiers and sharing their dangers. But the defenders were exhausted and outnumbered. Supplies were running low. The promised help from the West had not arrived. As April turned to May, the situation grew increasingly desperate. On the night of May 22, 1453, something happened that shattered what remained of the defenders' morale. As the moon rose over Constantinople, it did not shine with its usual brightness. Instead, it rose in shadow, and as the hours passed, it turned a deep, blood-red color. A total lunar eclipse was occurring, darkening the symbol of hope that the Byzantines had long believed would protect their city. The timing could not have been worse. For a population that believed the full moon guaranteed their safety, seeing it darken and turn the color of blood was terrifying. The eclipse seemed to confirm their worst fears. The ancient prophecy was being fulfilled. The divine protection they had trusted was being withdrawn. Panic spread through Constantinople. People wept in the streets. churches filled with worshippers desperately praying for deliverance. Some began to flee the city, trying to escape before the inevitable end. Even soldiers on the walls felt their confidence crumble. How could they defend a city that God himself seemed to have abandoned? Emperor Constantine tried to calm his people. He organized religious processions, carrying holy icons through the streets and praying for the city's salvation. He reminded the people that they had faced dark days before and survived. But even his efforts could not entirely dispel the gloom that had settled over Constantinople. The Ottoman forces surely noticed the eclipse as well, and they likely understood its psychological impact on the defenders. In the days following the eclipse, the pace of attacks intensified. Mehmed could sense that the defenders were wavering. The moment for the final assault was approaching. In the days after the eclipse, other strange events occurred, or at least, later accounts claimed they did. A mysterious light was said to have appeared above the dome of the great church of Hagia Sophia before shooting up into the sky. Unusual fogs rolled in from the sea. Whether these accounts are accurate or were added later to heighten the drama of the story, they reflect the atmosphere of dread that pervaded the city in its final days. The defenders had one last hope that relief might come from the west. Venetian ships were supposedly on their way. If they could just hold out a little longer, help might arrive. But as the days passed and no sails appeared on the horizon, even this hope faded. In the early hours of May 29, 1453, Mehmed II launched his final assault on Constantinople. The attack began shortly after midnight, and wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers threw themselves at the weakened walls. First came the irregular troops, expendable soldiers whose job was to tire the defenders. Then came the Anatolian soldiers, more disciplined and determined. Still, the walls held. But the defenders were exhausted after weeks of continuous combat and minimal sleep. Their numbers had been depleted by casualties. Their strength was failing. And then disaster struck. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander who had been the soul of the defense, was severely wounded by a gunshot. He was carried from the walls to seek medical attention, and his departure caused confusion and dismay among the defenders. Sometime in the early morning hours, Ottoman soldiers found a way into the city. Accounts differ on exactly how this happened. Some sources say a small gate had been left open or inadequately defended. Others say Ottoman troops simply overwhelmed a section of wall that had been weakened by cannon fire. Whatever the cause, once the Ottomans were inside, the defense began to collapse. Fighting continued in the streets, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Emperor Constantine XI, seeing that all was lost, reportedly removed any insignia that would identify him as emperor and charged into the final battle, determined to die defending his city. His body was never positively identified, though tradition holds that he fell fighting near one of the gates. By the afternoon of May 29th, Constantinople was in Ottoman hands. Mehmed II rode through the conquered city and went to the great church of Hagia Sophia. The building that had served as the spiritual heart of Orthodox Christianity for over 900 years was converted into a mosque. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of ancient Rome, had ceased to exist. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through the Christian world. For many in Europe, it was a catastrophe of the first order. Scholars, artists, and refugees fled westward, bringing with them manuscripts and knowledge that would contribute to the Renaissance. The Ottoman Empire established itself as a dominant power that would endure for centuries. And in the memory of those who survived, the blood-red eclipse of May 22nd remained a haunting symbol of all that had been lost. The moon had turned to blood, and the city had fallen. The heavens had warned of disaster, and disaster had come. Modern astronomy provides clear explanations for the celestial events that once terrified our ancestors. These explanations remove much of the mystery, but also raise important questions about how we should interpret the historical coincidences we have examined. Comets are among the oldest objects in our solar system. They formed billions of years ago from the same cloud of gas and dust that created the sun and planets. Most comets spend their existence in the cold outer reaches of the solar system, far beyond the orbit of Neptune. Occasionally, gravitational forces send a comet falling inward toward the sun. As it approaches, solar radiation heats the comet's icy surface, releasing gas and dust that form the glowing tail visible from Earth. Halley's Comet, the object that appeared before the Norman conquest, follows a predictable orbit that brings it close to Earth approximately every 75 to 76 years. It has been observed and recorded for over 2,000 years. The comet that appeared in 1066 was the same object that had appeared before and would appear again in 1145, 1301, and many times since. Its most recent visit was in 1986, and it will return in 2061. Lunar eclipses occur when the Earth passes directly between the Sun and the Moon, casting our planet's shadow across the lunar surface. This happens only when the Sun, Earth, and Moon are precisely aligned, which occurs 2 to 5 times per year somewhere on Earth. The red color that so frightened the defenders of Constantinople results from sunlight being filtered through Earth's atmosphere. Blue light is scattered away, while red light bends around the planet and reaches the Moon, giving it the blood-red appearance. From a scientific standpoint, there is no mechanism by which a comet or eclipse could cause events on Earth. Comets are millions of miles away and exert no measurable influence on our planet beyond their gravitational pull, which is negligible. Lunar eclipses are purely visual phenomena caused by shadows. They change nothing about the Moon itself or its relationship to Earth. Scientists point out that comets and eclipses occur regularly throughout history. If we were to examine every celestial event that occurred before a major historical moment, we would find many instances where no disaster followed. The Great Comet of 1811 also appeared before many events that had nothing to do with Napoleon. Halley's Comet appeared in 1910 before a period of relative peace in Europe, only for World War I to begin 4 years later, with no comet in sight. The scientific consensus is clear. Celestial events do not cause earthly disasters. Any apparent connection is coincidence, nothing more. Yet this explanation, while accurate, does not fully account for the remarkable timing of the events we have examined. It does not explain why these particular coincidences have resonated so powerfully across centuries of human memory. To understand why celestial omens have held such power over human imagination, we must look not at the stars, but at ourselves. The human brain is extraordinarily skilled at finding patterns. This ability served our ancestors well. Recognizing the pattern of seasons helped them plant and harvest crops. Noticing the patterns of animal behavior helped them hunt successfully. Pattern recognition is fundamental to human survival and intelligence. But this same ability can lead us astray. Psychologists use the term apophenia to describe the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. We see faces in clouds, hear words in random noise, and find significance in coincidences. This is not a flaw in human thinking, but a feature. Our brains are designed to find patterns, even when the evidence is incomplete. The cost of missing a real pattern was often death for our ancestors. So evolution favored minds that erred on the side of finding too many patterns rather than too few. Related to pattern recognition is confirmation bias, the tendency to remember information that confirms our existing beliefs, while forgetting information that contradicts them. When a comet appeared and disaster followed, people remembered both events and connected them. When a comet appeared and nothing happened, there was no dramatic story to tell, and the event faded from memory. Historians who have studied celestial records note that comets appeared throughout history with great regularity. Many appeared before periods of peace and prosperity. Many appeared before events of no particular significance. But these known events were rarely recorded with the same care as the apparent hits. Over centuries of selective recording, a pattern emerged that seemed to confirm the belief that comets foretold disaster, even though a more complete record would show no such correlation. The same principle applies to the 3 events we have examined. We remember 1066, 1453, and 1812, because the celestial events align so dramatically with historical disasters. We do not remember the many times comets appeared before Norman defeats or Ottoman setbacks, because those events did not fit the narrative. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We understand the world through narratives, and we are drawn to stories that feature meaningful connections and dramatic timing. A king who falls after ignoring a celestial warning is a better story than a king who falls for ordinary, political, and military reasons. A city that succumbs after the moon turns to blood is more memorable than a city that falls after a long siege with no unusual celestial events. Scholars who study folklore and mythology note that stories about celestial omens appear across virtually every human culture. This universality suggests that the connection between sky events and earthly disasters speaks to something deep in human psychology. We want the universe to be meaningful. We want our fates to be written in the stars. The alternative, that we live in a cosmos of pure chance, where great events happen for no cosmic reason, is harder for many people to accept. While celestial events cannot directly cause earthly disasters, beliefs about celestial events can certainly influence human behavior. This raises a fascinating possibility. Could the belief in omens have contributed to the very disasters that the omens supposedly predicted? Consider the case of Constantinople. The lunar eclipse of May 22, 1453, had no physical effect on the city's walls or the strength of its defenders, but the psychological effect was devastating. Soldiers who had been fighting courageously for weeks saw their morale shattered. Citizens who might have supported the defense gave way to despair. The emperor himself had to divert attention from military matters to conducting religious processions designed to calm the population. In the days following the eclipse, the defense of Constantinople may have weakened, not because of any celestial influence, but because the defenders believed the celestial influence was real. Their faith in divine protection had been a source of strength. When that faith was shaken, some of their fighting spirit went with it. The case of Napoleon presents a different but equally interesting psychological dimension. The comet of 1811 did not cause Napoleon to invade Russia. That decision was driven by political and strategic considerations that had nothing to do with the sky. But Napoleon's belief that the comet confirmed his destiny may have reinforced his natural overconfidence. Napoleon was a brilliant military commander, but brilliance combined with overconfidence can lead to disaster. If the comet strengthened his belief that fate was on his side, it may have made him less receptive to the legitimate concerns raised by his advisors. The warnings about Russian distances, supply difficulties, and winter weather came from experienced military men. A more humble commander might have listened. Napoleon, secure in his sense of destiny, pressed on. We cannot know for certain how much the comet influenced Napoleon's thinking, but we can observe that his interpretation of the celestial sign was exactly the interpretation that reinforced his existing inclinations. The comet told him what he wanted to hear. Among historians and scholars, there is general agreement that celestial events do not cause earthly disasters. However, there is more nuanced debate about how to understand the role these events played in history. Some historians take a strictly rationalist position. They argue that the celestial events are irrelevant to understanding the historical outcomes. The Battle of Hastings was decided by military factus exhaustion of the English army, Harold's tactical decisions, the effectiveness of Norman cavalry. The fall of Constantinople resulted from Ottoman military superiority, Byzantine weakness, and the failure of Western aid. Napoleon's defeat in Russia was caused by poor planning, Russian strategy, and the brutal winter. The comets and eclipses were mere background, adding color to the narrative, but explaining nothing. Other historians take a more cultural approach. They argue that we cannot understand historical actors without understanding their beliefs, even if those beliefs were mistaken. The people of 1066, 1453, and 1812 believed in celestial omens. Those beliefs influenced their emotions, their decisions, and their morale. To dismiss the celestial events entirely is to miss something important about how these people experienced their world. A third perspective acknowledges the limits of what we can truly know. We are confident in our scientific understanding of comets and eclipses. We know that these phenomena have natural causes and no supernatural powers. But we also know that our scientific understanding is continually evolving. Centuries ago, confident scholars knew that the Earth was the center of the universe. They were wrong. This is not to suggest that celestial events actually do cause earthly disasters. The evidence strongly indicates they do not. But a degree of humility is appropriate when making absolute claims about the nature of the universe. The cosmos is vast and strange, and our understanding of it, while advancing rapidly, remains incomplete. What we can say with confidence is this: the coincidences are remarkable. The timing between celestial events and historical disasters in these three cases is striking. Whether this timing is pure chance, psychological influence, or something else entirely, it has captured human imagination for centuries. And perhaps that imaginative power is itself significant, regardless of what it tells us about the physical universe. After examining the scientific, psychological, and historical perspectives, we are left with a nuanced picture. The stars did not warn of disaster in any literal sense. Comets and eclipses follow the laws of physics, indifferent to the affairs of kings and empires. The apparent connection between celestial events and historical catastrophes is a product of coincidence, selective memory, and the human need to find meaning in a vast and often frightening universe. Yet the power of these stories remains. They tell us something important about human nature, our longing for significance, our tendency to find patterns, and our vulnerability to beliefs that may not serve us well. The defenders of Constantinople were not foolish to fear the eclipse. They were human, responding as humans have always responded to signs they did not understand. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that we do not fully know why these coincidences occurred when they did. We can explain away the connection, but we cannot explain the timing. And in that gap between explanation and mystery, the stories continue to resonate. From the earliest moments of human consciousness, we have looked up at the night sky and wondered. The stars seemed eternal and unchanging, while our lives on Earth were brief and filled with uncertainty. It was natural to believe that the heavens held answers that the Earth could not provide. If we could only learn to read the celestial language, perhaps we could understand our fate. This longing for cosmic meaning has never truly disappeared. We have traded astrologers for astronomers, prophecies for probability, and divine signs for data. Yet the fundamental desire remains. We want to believe that our lives matter, that our struggles have purpose, and that the universe is not indifferent to our joys and sorrows. When we gaze at the stars today, we may understand them scientifically in ways our ancestors never could, but we still feel something of what they felt, a sense of wonder mixed with a quiet hope that we are not alone in the darkness. The belief that celestial events carry meaning offers both comfort and terror. It is comforting to think that the universe notices us, that great powers watch over human affairs, and sends signs to guide our choices. This belief places humanity at the center of cosmic attention, making our lives significant in the grandest possible way. But this same belief can be terrifying. If the heavens send warnings, then we bear responsibility for heeding them. If disaster follows a celestial sign, perhaps we are to blame for not listening. The people of Constantinople who saw the blood moon must have felt not only fear, but guilt. Had they failed to pray earnestly enough? Had their sins brought divine punishment upon them? The weight of cosmic significance can crush as easily as it can uplift. In our modern age, we have largely freed ourselves from these burdens. We know that eclipses are shadows and comets are ice. We no longer blame ourselves when the moon turns red. Yet something has been lost, along with the superstition. The universe that our ancestors inhabited was meaningful, even when it was frightening. The universe revealed by science is beautiful but silent. It offers no warnings, because it has nothing to say. Perhaps the deepest tragedy in these three stories is not that celestial warnings went unheeded. It is that earthly warnings were ignored as well. In each case, there were voices of caution, practical concerns raised by people who needed no comet to see danger approaching. Before Napoleon invaded Russia, experienced military officers warned him of the difficulties ahead. They spoke of vast distances, harsh winters, and the Russian strategy of retreat. They pointed to the challenges of supplying an army across such enormous territory. These warnings came not from the stars, but from careful analysis and historical knowledge. Napoleon dismissed them, trusting in his own genius and destiny. Before the fall of Constantinople, Emperor Constantine knew his situation was desperate. He sent embassy after embassy to the courts of Western Europe, begging for soldiers, ships, and supplies. The warnings he issued about Ottoman power and Byzantine weakness were accurate and urgent. Yet the help that came was too little and too late. The Christian kingdoms of the West were divided by their own quarrels and unwilling to sacrifice for a distant city. Before the Battle of Hastings, Harold of England knew that invasion was coming. He did not need a comet to tell him that William of Normandy was gathering ships. The warning was obvious to anyone who paid attention to political realities. Yet Harold found himself caught between threats from north and south, forced to exhaust his army in one battle before facing another. What unites these stories is not celestial warning, but human limitation. Leaders who were brave and capable nonetheless made choices that led to disaster. They were not stupid or wicked. They were human, subject to the same weaknesses that afflict us all. They overestimated their own abilities. They underestimated their enemies. They hoped that fortune would favor them, even when evidence suggested otherwise. The comets and eclipses did not cause these disasters, but neither did they prevent them. The celestial signs, whatever meaning people assigned to them, could not overcome the fundamental reality of human nature. We see what we want to see. We believe what we want to believe, and we often ignore warnings, whether from the stars or from our fellow humans, when those warnings conflict with our desires. There is something poignant in imagining the celestial bodies as silent witnesses to human drama. Halley's Comet passed through the inner solar system in 1066, its icy surface glowing in the sunlight as it had done countless times before. It witnessed the fall of Harold and the rise of William. Then it continued on its long orbit, returning 76 years later to a world that had changed beyond recognition. The same comet returned in 1145 and found the Normans firmly established in England. It returned in 1222 and found their descendants fighting each other in civil wars. It returned again and again, each time observing a different chapter of human history, never speaking, never intervening. The comet simply continued its ancient journey, indifferent to the kingdoms that rose and fell beneath its light. The moon that darkened over Constantinople in 1453 continues to orbit Earth today. It still sometimes passes through our planet's shadow, turning red as it did on that fateful night over 5 centuries ago. The moon remembers nothing of the siege, the eclipse, or the fall of the city. It is a ball of rock, beautiful but unconscious. The meaning of that blood-red night exists only in human memory. We are the ones who create meaning. The stories we tell about celestial warnings reveal more about ourselves than about the cosmos. We project our hopes and fears onto the night sky, finding patterns that reflect our own concerns. The universe does not speak to us, but we speak to ourselves. Through the universe, this is not a weakness. It is part of what makes us human. Today, we no longer scan the skies for comets to tell us of coming disasters. We have scientists, analysts, and experts who study the world and issue warnings based on evidence and reason. Yet, how well do we listen? Climate scientists warn of rising temperatures, melting ice, and changing weather patterns. Epidemiologists warned of pandemic risks before disease swept across the globe. Economists identified troubling trends in markets and societies. These warnings come not from the stars, but from careful study. They are based on data that our ancestors could never have gathered. And yet, we often respond to them with the same mixture of denial, wishful thinking, and selective interpretation that characterized earlier ages. We are no longer ruled by superstition, but we are still ruled by human nature. We still find it difficult to accept unpleasant truths. We still interpret information in ways that confirm what we already believe. We still hope that problems will solve themselves or that our luck will hold. In this sense, we are not so different from the people who watched comets and feared eclipses. This is not meant as criticism or judgment. It is simply an observation about the continuity of human experience. We are the same creatures who looked up at Halley's Comet in 1066, who watched the moon turn red over Constantinople, who marched into Russia believing that destiny was on our side. We carry the same brains, the same emotions, and the same vulnerabilities. Perhaps the lesson of these stories is not that we should have listened to the stars. Perhaps it is that we should listen to each other. The warnings that matter most do not come from the heavens. They come from the accumulated wisdom of human experience, from those who study problems carefully and speak uncomfortable truths. Whether we choose to hear those warnings is up to us. We have traveled through nearly 1,000 years of human history, from the fields of Hastings to the frozen roads of Russia to the ancient walls of Constantinople. 3 different eras, 3 different cultures, 3 different disasters. Yet a common thread connects them all. In 1066, a blazing comet crossed the skies of Europe. 2 men looked up at the same light and drew opposite conclusions. Harold saw doom. William saw destiny. The comet offered no clarification, no voice to explain its meaning. It simply blazed and faded, leaving humans to interpret as they would. Within months, Harold lay dead on a battlefield, and England had a new master. In 1811, the great comet illuminated the night for nearly 9 months. Napoleon, at the height of his power, saw confirmation of his invincibility. He marched the largest army in European history into Russia, confident that fate was on his side. Less than a year later, that army had been destroyed, and Napoleon's empire had begun its final decline. In 1453, the moon turned blood red over a city that had stood for more than 1,000 years. The defenders of Constantinople saw their hopes die with the light of the moon. Within days, their city had fallen. Their emperor was dead, and an age had ended. In each case, the celestial event did not cause the disaster. The Battle of Hastings was fought because of political claims and military realities. Napoleon's invasion failed because of distance, weather, and Russian strategy. Constantinople fell because of Ottoman strength and Byzantine weakness. These were human events with human causes. Yet in each case, the celestial event shaped how people understood what was happening to them. It provided a framework for meaning, a way to interpret the chaos of history. Those who lived through these events did not experience them as random. They experienced them as foretold, as part of a larger cosmic story in which they were both actors and witnesses. We can explain comets. We can explain eclipses. We understand the physics of ice, sublimating into glowing tails and shadows painting the moon red. Science has answered the questions that tormented our ancestors. The universe operates according to laws that we can discover and describe. But science cannot explain the timing. Why did Halley's Comet appear in 1066, of all years, when England stood on the brink of transformation? Why did the Great Comet of 1811 blaze brightest, just as Napoleon prepared his greatest gamble? Why did a lunar eclipse occur on May 22nd, 1453, just 7 days before Constantinople's final fall? These questions have no scientific answer because they assume a connection that science denies. From a purely rational perspective, the timing is coincidence. Celestial events occur throughout history. Major historical events also occur throughout history. Sometimes they happen to coincide. If we search through all of history, we would find many comets that appeared before nothing significant, many eclipses that preceded years of peace, and yet the coincidences we have examined remain striking. The human mind struggles to accept that such dramatic alignments are purely random. We feel that there must be more to the story, even if we cannot articulate what that something might be. Perhaps this feeling itself is meaningful. Perhaps it tells us something about our nature as meaning-seeking beings in a universe that does not offer easy answers. We stand between two great truths. The universe operates by physical laws that do not concern themselves with human affairs, and yet we cannot help but seek significance in the patterns we observe. Both truths are real. Learning to hold them together may be one of the challenges of being human. The mystery that remains is not really about comets or eclipses. It is about us. How should we live in a universe that we can explain but not fully understand? How should we respond to coincidences that seem meaningful but may not be? These questions have no final answers. They are part of the ongoing human journey. We continue to watch the sky. Halley's Comet will return in 2061, and people around the world will look up to see the same object that crossed the heavens before the Norman conquest. They will know exactly what they are seeing. They will understand its orbit, its composition, and its history. And yet, some of them will still feel a shiver of wonder at the sight of that ancient traveler passing through their sky. Eclipses still draw millions of observers. When the moon turns red or the sun disappears behind the lunar disk, people gather to watch. They take photographs and share their experience on devices that would have seemed magical to any earlier generation. They know that no disaster will follow the eclipse, yet they still feel compelled to witness it, to participate in an experience that connects them to every human who has ever looked up at the sky. Perhaps the real message of these stories is not found in the stars at all. Perhaps it is found in how we respond to uncertainty. The people of 1066, 1453, and 1812 faced futures they could not predict. They looked for signs because they wanted guidance in a world that offered none. They interpreted those signs according to their hopes and fears, their beliefs and traditions. We do the same today. Even if our signs are different, we look for patterns in data, trends in charts, predictions from experts. We seek certainty in a world that remains fundamentally uncertain, and we often hear what we want to hear, believe what we want to believe. Just as Harold and William both found confirmation in the same comet, the stars did not warn of disaster, but they witnessed it, and in witnessing, they remind us of something important. We are small creatures on a small planet, living brief lives under an ancient sky. The universe does not speak to us in words we can understand, but it offers us beauty, wonder, and mystery. What we do with these gifts is up to us. We have journeyed together through centuries of history, following the light of comets and the shadow of eclipses across battlefields and besieged cities. These stories remind us that humanity has always looked upward for guidance, even when the answers remained just out of reach. Now, we turn the question to you. Do you believe that celestial events can truly warn of coming disasters? Or are these remarkable coincidences simply the result of chance and selective memory? Perhaps you know of other historical moments when the stars seemed to speak before tragedy struck. We would love to hear your thoughts. Share your ideas in the comments below. Tell us about celestial events from your own culture or history that we did not cover. And consider this. What warnings might we be ignoring today? Not from the stars, but from the world around us. If this story moved you or made you think, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of history's greatest mysteries. Share it with someone who loves looking up at the night sky. Until next time, keep wondering.